Creative block for me can sometimes feel like I forgot how to draw, or any idea that I think of doesn't match the brief. I'm trying to create and just nothing's coming to mind. It almost gets me questioning, can I draw? Hi, I'm Smitesh Mistry, an illustrator and content creator based in London. The type of work I like to create is fun and surreal illustrations incorporating a bunch of colour. In this class, I'm going to be taking you through how I've used AI to help me conquer creative block and improve as an illustrator. Being a creative, I'm sure that you've experienced creative block, and going through it isn't the nicest feeling. However, getting on the other side feels 10 times better. You got your mojo back and you feel like designs are coming to you left, right and centre. The project that we'll be creating in this class is an illustration about creative block. The idea for this illustration is going to be generated from the AI and the prompts that we feed it. I'll be walking you through ways in which you can prompt ChatGPT and then further develop those concepts. And then we'll be putting those into another AI engine where we'll be generating reference images for lighting, composition, or even color palette reference. And then we'll be implementing those into our sketch before we get into the illustration itself. I think the concepts that we're going to learn in this class will be fairly transferable, as the way in which we're going to be prompting the AI engines can be tailored and applied depending on which creative industry you're in. Feel free to follow along, or with the skills that we learn, keep them in your arsenal for when you are experiencing creative block and want a way to break through it a lot quicker whilst implementing AI into your creative process. Alright, let's get started. Since AI's come out, I know there's a lot of talk about how it's replacing or taking over the creative industry by producing these images. But after playing with it a little bit more, I've decided to implement it and use it within my creative process. I've been using it as a tool, and one way that I've used it is to break through creative block. The two main types that I use are ChatGPT and Adobe Firefly. ChatGPT, I like to refer to it as just another human. I like to use it whilst brainstorming and generating ideas, or prompts in order for me to sketch. And with Adobe Firefly, I like to use that to generate reference images. So whilst I'm sketching an idea and I can't imagine, say, a character in a certain position, I'd use Adobe Firefly and prompt it with something that will help me imagine or visualize a way in which a character is interacting with an environment, and then use it as a reference image for my sketch. In this class, I'll be walking you through my process of how I deal with creative block whilst using AI. Initially, we're going to be starting off with a concept, which is creative block. And then we're going to using this, and then we'll be feeding ChatGPT with prompts to help it give you some ideas of what to draw. Once it's given you some ideas, we're going to be using that, and then we'll be plugging that into Adobe Firefly to help you generate reference images for your sketches. And then what I'm going to be doing is taking you through my process from sketching to a final illustration. The tools that I'll be using in this lesson will be my iPad. I'll be using this to create all the illustrations that I'll be doing and for the sketching. In particular, I'll be using Procreate. And for ChatGPT, I'll be using my laptop. But feel free to use your phone or a tablet too. I know in this class I'll be covering how I use AI with illustration, but I do feel it's a great tool for many creative industries, whether you're a photographer trying to plan a photo shoot, or a songwriter struggling on what lyrics to choose. ChatGPT and AI is a great way of saving time, but also great for brainstorming ideas you may not have thought of. Now that I've covered the materials I'll be using in this class and run through AI, how I'll be using it, and how I've implemented it into my process, let's get you on your way of getting through your creative block. How do you know if you're experiencing creative block, and what are some of the signs? Either you forget how to draw, or you got your blank piece of paper or your canvas in front of you and nothing's coming to mind, or drawing just feels hard for you, or whatever you're creating, it just feels hard. Or sometimes you start questioning your own ability as to, wait, have I forgot how to draw, or how come I can't draw this time? These are a few of the ways in which creative block has shown up for me, but depending on which creative industry you're in, it can show up in many other ways. I think it's time that we start generating a way in which we can start breaking through creative block when we are experiencing it. Okay, so before we get into it and start using ChatGPT, let's brainstorm a few ideas or ways in which you can prompt ChatGPT, depending on the type of creative block you're feeling. Okay, so if you're just sat at the desk and you're facing a blank piece of paper and just nothing's coming to you, one thing I like to ask it is, give me something to draw. But then say, for example, you already have a specific style and you know what type of illustration you want to create, you can start tailoring it depending on what your style is. So one way that I like to do it is my illustrations are quite surreal. So I like to prompt it with, maybe give me 3 or 5 surreal illustrations that I could create. Or say, for example, you have a very specific client brief in which you need to work towards. Say, for example, it's a clothing brand and they need an illustration of their models or aspects of their clothing in certain conditions. So then you can prompt it with very specific or very niche prompts. So with this one, I'm going to say, give me 5 ideas of an illustration involving character with regards to a fashion brand. Another way I like to use it is I give myself a frame or give myself a structure in which I can use, depending on the number of prompts or ideas you want to get. So I'll start off by saying, give me 5 and then blank. And then that blank is where you can kind of input your style or the type of work that you create. So for me, that's going to be surreal. So it's going to be, give me 5 surreal illustrations about and then for me, a lot of my illustrations involve a character. So it's going to be, give me 5 surreal illustrations about a character. And then you can add a verb after it. So it could be swimming, walking, talking. For the purpose of this class, the prompt that we're going to be using is with regards to creative block. One way in which you can ask this is, give me 5 illustration ideas about creative block. Or it could be, give me 5 illustration ideas to conquer creative block. Or what we can do is we can combine some of the previous ones that we thought of into this one. So it could be, give me 5 and then blank where we input our style. So for me, it'll be surreal. So it'll be, give me 5 surreal illustrations about creative block. And like I mentioned before, a lot of my illustrations involve characters. So it could be, give me 5 illustration ideas about a character experiencing creative block. Okay, so now that we've gone through and brainstormed some ideas and some prompts that we can feed ChatGPT, let's head over and see what ideas it generates. Now that we've brainstormed the type of ideas and the prompts that we want to feed into ChatGPT, let me show you how I like to use it and how you can sway it depending on your own creative style. One tip that I'd give, especially whilst using AI, is it can feel a bit odd speaking to a computer, but I like to imagine just as if I'm speaking to another human, trying to brainstorm with them, and tailor the questions or ask the questions as if you're talking to a human, as opposed to just asking interview questions. This way it'll give you a lot more ideas based around or tailored towards your style. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the last prompt that we created, and then I'm going to tailor it depending on my style, and you feel free to do the same with yours. So at the moment I've got, give me 5 blank, and in that blank, like I mentioned before, a lot of my illustrations are surreal. So I'm going to change that to surreal. Give me 5 surreal ideas about and like mentioned, so a lot of my illustrations have characters in there. So I'm going to change that to character. At the moment we've got, give me 5 surreal illustration ideas about a character who's going through a creative block. So I'm just going to press enter now and then see what type of responses it gives me. So with this, generally just wait a little while for it to do its thing. Okay, so with the prompts that I generated, there's one that's speaking to me. So let me read it out to you. A character is shown as a shady figure surrounded by a swarm of brightly coloured butterflies. The butterflies represent the character's creative ideas, but they are fluttering around aimlessly, unable to find a place to land and take root. So for me, that is more along the lines of the type of illustration that I would create. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use point 2, refer to that in the message bar at the bottom, and then ask it to generate more ideas based on that single point. So the way I'm going to word this is, give me 4 more ideas based around point 2. Okay, so what ChatGPT has done here is it's taken the butterfly aspect of point 2 and applied that to all of these concepts. It's changed how the character is shown within the illustration. So with this first idea, that one speaks to me a lot more. So this one goes, a character is shown standing in front of a blank canvas or an empty page, surrounded by a cluttered and chaotic workspace. The character's thoughts are depicted as a swirling cloud of butterflies, floating around aimlessly, unable to find a way onto the canvas. So for me, I'm not too much into the butterfly idea, but I like the idea of a character stood in front of a blank canvas. So I'm going to take that aspect from point 1, reword it, and then ask it to give me more prompts about a character stood in front of a blank canvas. This is a general process I like to use. Like I mentioned, it's like a brainstorming. So if you're in a brainstorming session and you get a bunch of ideas and you like one particular idea, you can go further down that route and ask everyone else to kind of tailor their responses based on that one prompt that you like initially. That's basically what I'm doing here. So the way I've worded it is, I like the idea of the character standing in front of a blank canvas. Could I have more ways of this being represented? Okay, so with these prompts, there's one aspect of point 2 that I quite like. Here it says the character is depicted standing in a vast empty landscape with only the blank canvas in front of them. For me, that relates a lot, especially when I'm going through it, because it can feel quite isolating, especially when you feel like there's no one around and there's no inspiration or anything anywhere that you go, you feel like there's no inspiration around you. So that one speaks quite clearly to me. So as you've seen here with the process that I do, I like to read what ideas I've been given, take aspects of maybe point 1, point 3, merge them together and then ask it to give you more ideas. What I'm going to do now is go in and further tailor this around my style. So the way I've tailored this next question is, I like the idea of the character in a vast landscape with a blank canvas. Can you give me a few ways I can add elements in order to help communicate the creative aspect? Okay, so I quite like the way that the first prompt sounds. So here it says, a character could be surrounded by natural elements like mountains, trees, and wildlife. The mountains could represent the character's grand ideas, whilst the trees and wildlife could represent the smaller, more subtle ideas. So right now, whilst I'm doing this, whilst I'm going through ChatGPT, at the same time, I'm kind of imagining the way that this could look, which is helping me prompt it with more questions, helping me tailor it more and more towards my style. There's another one here too I quite like. The character could be carrying a backpack or a satchel filled with art supplies, such as paints, brushes, and canvases. This would show that the character is well prepared and has the tool needed to bring their creative vision to life. So this could be in a way where the character is ready, like he knows he wants to create something. He's got all of his materials ready, but he's out in the world, gaining inspiration, trying to break through his creative block. So I quite like the way that sounds too. And then we've got this one here as well, where the character could be shown interacting with the landscape in some way, such as painting a beautiful sunset or sketching a mountain. This would show that the character is inspired by the world around them, and that their creative process is a reflection of their experience. That one definitely speaks to me, as a lot of my illustration that I do create is based on personal experiences or emotions or thoughts I'm going through at that time. Okay, so what we're going to do is, with these 3 prompts that I feel resonate with me the most, I'm going to be taking those and I'm going to be creating some initial sketches based on these prompts, just to kind of visualize how these ideas will look. Now that we've got our prompts from ChatGPT, let's start sketching out a few of these and decide on which one we like. So with this, what I like to do is I like to start off with very rough thumbnail sketches. So very small and like the details not required at this moment. It's just a matter of getting block shapes in there. This phase for me is kind of just getting a composition and just a feel for how the illustration would end up. So one thing that I like to do is just start off by creating a very simple grid just to kind of house our illustrations within. So right now I'm splitting this up into 3 just so I can explore each different idea that we prompted. Based on the first prompt that we got given, the character could be surrounded by natural elements like mountains, trees, and wildlife. The mountains could represent the character's grand ideas, whilst the trees and wildlife can represent the smaller, more subtle ideas. So with this one, the first that comes to mind is still having the character within this vast landscape, but then having it surrounded by all these mountains and trees and plants. So I'm just going to go in and sketch a very rough idea. So for this, I want the character to be in the center of the frame, as that's what I want the audience to focus on when they are visualizing this illustration. So that's my first concept that I've created. Again, just very rough and just kind of imagining what it would feel like being in that vast sort of landscape. So what I've got is the character in the middle of the frame, very small, and the other elements very big, and emphasize the aspect that the character is very small and in this very open and large environment. So that's the first prompt. Second prompt was the character could be carrying a backpack or a satchel filled with art supplies, such as paints, brushes, and canvases. The first that comes to mind is a character walking in nature, but with a backpack with these art supplies in its bag. So I'm just going to start again, just rough sketching, just to kind of get a base down. So that's the second drawing. As you can see, just very basic, and it's very rough, just to kind of imagine what it would look like. This one is kind of speaking to me. But let's move on to the third one. So the third one is, the character could be shown interacting with the landscape in some way, such as painting a beautiful sunset or sketching a mountain range. So with this one, the first that comes to mind is having a landscape, but then having the character interacting in a way where it looks like he's finishing off a line maybe, or colouring a hill. So with this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a pencil, but I'm going to have the pencil really big and the character very small in comparison to it. So for me, the main one that's speaking to me is the centre one. And the reason why is because I always have my art supplies at hand and I'm always ready to create, but I always feel like it's a mission, or it's something that I have to go out, or is a challenge I have to face. But also for me, going out in nature is a place that I do like to find inspiration from. What I'm going to do next is I want to head into Adobe Firefly just to gain some reference images, before I start refining this sketch, I want to make sure the reference images that I have are more relatable and more accurate, so my illustration can convey the message a lot more clearer. Now that we've sketched out the prompts that ChatGPT has given us, and we've chosen the one that we want to move forward with, what I like to do before refining the sketch is to head into Adobe Firefly to help me gain some reference images based on this very specific illustration. So before I go into Firefly, what I like to do is just kind of analyze past this illustration, which I would want some help with, or some reference images. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy this and make it slightly bigger just for referencing purposes. So for me, trying to imagine what body position a character could be in can be difficult. And trying to search on Google or Pinterest for a reference image, you could spend hours just searching. So this is the first thing I'm going to search in Adobe Firefly. So just the way in which that the character is stood, you want to make it as convincing as possible. And like mentioned, with this illustration, it's the character's facing a challenge. So one thing that came to mind is we could potentially have this character walking up a hill. So that could be another thing that we could prompt the AI software with. Secondly, a character holding a backpack. What kind of posture or what body language would that character have? So trying to sketch that and communicate that through the illustration is important. So that's the second thing that I'm going to search reference images for. And then finally, this could just be an optional one, but a very specific wardrobe. So say if you want the character to be wearing say an apron with paint stains, or if you want a character dressed in like loungewear, this is something you can also prompt the AI software with. So let's head over to Adobe Firefly and let's start chucking in the prompts and seeing what images we get back. So I'm just going to search it as if I'm trying to ask for a very specific image. So I'm going to start off by saying a character walking up a hill. In this case, because it's representing me, I'm going to say a male character walking up a hill. Okay, so as you can see here, the type of reference image it's given us isn't exactly what I've sketched. So one thing I need to tell it is to give us a side view of this character walking up a hill. So I've got a side view of a male character walking up a hill. And let's click generate and see what comes up. So this is perfect. We've got a few different options in which we can see how the limbs, so the legs, the body, the head, how they're all working together to kind of communicate that the character is walking up a hill. So at this stage, what I like to do is I like to take either a screenshot or a picture of this using the iPad and then start sketching a framework over these images just to kind of build mine out a bit further. One thing I do find helpful is on the side of this, you can choose the style. So we've got photo, graphic, or art. Sometimes I find photo a lot easier as it does relate a lot more to the way in which a character can walk, as I feel like the cartoon or the graphic ones can kind of communicate a bit of personality or their own style already added to that, which is not what we want. Remember, we're just using these as a tool. So one thing I've realized with this type of AI software is the more that you describe it, the more accurate the result will be. So at the moment, I've got a side view of a male character walking up a hill, but as you can see here, I want both legs in display because I quite like this one here where you can see it's uphill and you can see the character, but it's only giving me one leg. So let's refer and let's add in where both legs are visible. And sometimes the thing with AI, it's not always going to give you what you're looking for. Remember, it's just a tool. It's not going to do the job for you. Okay, so what you'll find with this is you will have to play around with it a little bit, change the prompts, change the filters on the side, just to kind of gain the images or generate the images that you're looking for specifically. So what I've done now is I've changed the prompt. So I just changed it to a side view of a male walking up a hill. And then I've changed some of the filters on the side. So I've changed to a graphic and then ticked hyper realistic. There is an image here that I do like and I feel it will work perfectly for this illustration. So my normal process is to go in and take a picture of this and then start applying this over this sketch. Or you could take a screenshot if that's more helpful for you. So what I like to do is copy the sketch onto a new artboard, fill the page with it, and then start applying the references that we're searching onto this illustration. So I'm going to reduce the opacity. And I'm going to go in and take a picture of the reference that I like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the opacity on this one, and I'm only using this reference image as a frame for the character, almost like a skeleton. So let me show you how I do this. So on a new layer, I've dropped the opacity of the reference image, and then on the layer above it, I'm going to start sketching this. So what I like to do is just go in and sketch in the bones. See here, as you can see, the reference image hasn't generated a foot, but I'm just going to go in and imagine where it'd be. And then the overall body language is slightly in forwards, and then we've got the head here. And And with the arms, what I want it to feel is like this bag's heavy. You're carrying all these supplies with you. So I'm going to head back into Adobe Firefly and trying to find a reference of a character with their elbows bent, just to kind of make sure that the character's body language is representing what I'm trying to communicate. So what I've searched is a side view of a character with both their arms holding a heavy backpack. So because the character that we're illustrating is the character from its side, only one arm's going to be visible. So for this reference, I'm just going to be using how this arm's placed on the backpack. So again, I'm going to take a picture and then start adding it to this illustration. And as you can see, the image is the wrong way. So I'm just going to go in and flip this. And again, reduce the opacity and put it behind the sketch. And I'm just going to scale it on how I want to use it. So with this, you can see that the arm is at this type of angle. So I'm just going to try to recreate this on my frame. One thing to bear in mind is, depending on the style that you illustrate, incorporate this into the skeleton that you're doing. So with me, a lot of my characters are highly out of proportion. So they've got long legs, tiny torso, and then long arms, and then small head. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you this initial skeleton, and then I'm going to go in and change it depending on my style. And now again, I'm going to be using this character as a reference for the backpack too. So in here, it's landing at its hip area. So on here, it's going to be around here. But you'll see what I do. This is just the initial reference, and I'm going to go in and then further develop this. This looks very basic right now, and you may be thinking, how are you going to get from this to illustration? But the next thing I like to do is just kind of, I call it adding the meat back on the bones again. So making sure your proportions are all right, and then adding in the limbs, adding the muscles and all that type of stuff. So I'm just going to go in now and start adding this. And you'll see as I'm doing this, I'm going to be changing the skeleton. This is just a base. Now I'm going to change it to how the proportion of my characters generally are. So I'm going to go in, make the legs a lot longer, and then shorten the upper body. So this is what it looks like once I've altered the proportions according to my illustration. Now let's go in and start adding in the flesh. So I'm going to reduce the opacity on this layer, and then using the initial sketch I did as reference, and start adding in more detail. What also I like to do is just keep these reference images at the side, just so you can refer back to them. So the reason why I've done this is I want to see which leg was in front. So you can see the leg that's closest to us is the one that's at the back. So let's add that in too. So what I'm doing here is, with this reference image, I'm just seeing how the bottom of the strap interacts with the bottom of the rucksack. So you can see it's coming here, then it's attaching down here. I'm just going to do the same with this. And I'm using this reference image of the placement of the head. It's going to be slightly forward compared to the shoulders. So we'll turn off the reference images and the skeleton. So we're slowly getting closer to the final outcome. So here's the second version. So the first one is the thumbnail. Then we have the skeleton, and then we build upon the skeleton using the reference images that we found. Okay, so now that we've got the base sketch of the character, I'm going to go into Adobe Firefly again and see what kind of environments and mountains or hills and stuff that it can provide me, just to kind of give me some more inspiration of the environment that this character can be walking in. Now that we've used Adobe Firefly to gain references to help us with this sketch, let's go in and refine this further. Now that we've pulled references from Firefly, what we're going to do is I'm going to go in and further refine the sketch. The way I like to do this is I like to choose, say, an outfit or the hairstyle, and even choose the light source that I'm going to be doing before I start adding color to the illustration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this layer onto a new artboard and then start fresh. So what I'm going to do is drop the opacity and then sketch on top of this all the things that I mentioned. So with this part, it's key to make sure that your style is consistent. So like I mentioned, a lot of my characters have the long legs and the short body. So I'm just going to emphasize this more with baggy trousers and a tight top. So what we're doing here is we're kind of adding like the flesh to the bones that we created in the previous one. So just kind of personalizing it to your own style. I've gone over the initial skeleton that we built. I've added some clothes and a little bit more character, kind of personalized it to my style. Now what I like to do is go in and refine the other elements. I wanted to have the backpack full of art supplies. So I'm going to go in and make those a lot bigger than they usually would be. So just adding a little side pocket for a little ruler. And I always find it helpful to personalize your illustrations, especially if you're going through it, trying to create the character as if it is you. So at this stage, what I like to do is looking at the frame that we created in the previous lesson with all the foliage and the environment. I like to, after having the character fully done, I like to decide, like, do I still want this much? Do I want less? The message or the illustration that we're illustrating is about breaking through. So I do feel like the foliage and the environment, I do want it to be quite vast. One thing I do like to do in my illustrations is create the depth. So have a foreground, have the subject in the center of the frame, and then have a background too. So I like to do this by adding some bushes, some leaves, and some foliage in the foreground. Whilst doing this part of the illustration, ideas do come in, and because we are trying to break through creative block, having the character walking during a sunrise feels like you're trying to, like, the day's just started, crack of dawn, you want to get through this challenge. So I'm thinking, I know the sun was up on this side initially, but I'm thinking maybe you can have it like a sunrise. And I always like to finish my illustrations, especially the sketching part, with some clouds. So just so I know, when I come to the colouring part of this illustration, I know how to add the shadows and the highlights. Because we've got a light source in the illustration, the sun, I'm going to have the character lit from the front. So the easiest way I like to remember is the side of the character or the thing that you're illustrating that's furthest away from the light source is where the shadow will be. So I'll select in the round brush, and then, like I mentioned, anything on the far side of the light source should be in the shadow. So I'm just going to go through and add this in now. Okay, so now that we've refined the sketch and chose a light source, what I like to do next is choose a color palette. So the color palette that I'll be using will be one that resonates with me quite a lot, as a lot of my illustrations are quite surreal and abstract. So the colors that I'll be using won't be matching the things that you'll generally see. Using this color palette, I'm going to go in and color block, meaning just fill out the sections fairly roughly, just to kind of get an idea of how the colors are going to work together. So again, on a new layer, just underneath all of it, I'm going to go through it and start choosing colors. A lot of my characters generally have yellow skin. I'm not sure why, but it's just something that I've gravitated towards. One tip that I like to use is, if you are creating the layers, like the foreground, the center, and then the background, I always have the foreground a lot darker and the background a lot lighter to kind of give it that depth. So these bushes in the front are going to be a lot darker, just to help the character stand out a little bit too. Whilst drawing or adding the colours, I do feel like there needs to be a bit more contrast. As you can see here, the hills in the back and the skin tone is the exact same. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a little bit of orange or green just behind the ankles and the legs, just to kind of make sure that they pop out. Okay, so as you're seeing, I am not following the sketch that I did. This is because I want to make sure the overall illustration feels balanced with the colour too. So I was make sure, like you saw what I was doing with the orange, I was changing the green and the orange just to kind of see what I feel works best. And then once I've done this, I'm going to go in and then just update the sketch that we did initially. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the way this is looking. You saw the process that I went through. Initially with the sketch, I started adding the clothes and the hairstyle and refining some elements. And then when I went in and added the colour, I further refined the sketch even more, just to kind of make it feel personalised to me, but also to make it feel like the colours are balanced. Now that we've worked through some details, let's move forward and finish this illustration. If you've been following along whilst taking this class, this is where we'll go through and finish our illustration. So what I'm going to do is take the first two layers, so the sketch and the shadows layer. I'm just going to swipe them both to the left. I'm going to drag them and then create a new artboard. And just drop those there. Let's rearrange the layers in the right order again. And merge them by pinching, and then I'm just going to reduce the opacity. So this part of my process is creating this illustration that we've done, but a lot more neater, and adding in little details here and there, which will make the illustration just pop. So I've opened up a reference of the color blocking and the sketch that we did, and now I'm just going to use this as reference to kind of finesse the illustration. So with this, I found it helpful to start off with the layers that are closest to you, and then work your way backwards. One aspect of my style is that the lines are quite smooth and flowy. This is a great time to kind of refine that, depending on what your style is. So I like to create each element on a different layer. As you'll see when we come to it, when I'm adding in texture and shading, it's easier to add that if each element's on a different layer. Now let's make a start on the character. So as you can see in this reference, the leg is in between both these layers. So I want to make sure I'm selected below the foreground, but in front of the previous ones, just so the leg pops out. So for this, I'm just going to drag the sketch to the top, just so I can see it again. I do find it handy to just turn the canvas, depending on the way that I'm drawing the line. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy this sketch layer just on its own, just so I can see a little clearer. There we go. Okay, so one thing I'm thinking here, whilst doing this section of the illustration, is I know the arm's going to be on top of the body, but I'm just deciding whether this should be on a new layer, or I do it all together, then when I come to the shading, play around with it then. So I think what I'm going to do is keep the arm on a separate layer, and then have the body on the layer below it. Even whilst doing this section of the creative process, you will find yourself still making changes, and it's okay to do that. I quite like when that happens, because for me, this is what it feels like when I'm back in my flow and I'm not experiencing the creative block. So it's good if you're still changing things at this point. Another part of my style is I just don't draw hands and feet, so they're always just blobs or just big chunks of some sort. So now for the backpack, because I've drawn the arm, I want the backpack to lay behind the arm. So let me find the arm layer and then create a new layer below that to create the backpack. And as I'm doing this, I'm referring back to the reference that we did just for the colors. So because the backpack, I want it to be behind the arm, I just selected the arm layer and then create a new layer below it. And for bigger objects, I do find it helpful increasing your brush size just to kind of get a smoother line. I remember it's important to keep this true to your style. As we mentioned earlier, like when you're experiencing creative block, it kind of feels like you forgot to draw or the way that you normally draw. So really embracing your own style does help in this stage too. I'm just going to have the strap coming over his shoulder and then into his hands and then coming back around. Okay, so I need the strap actually in front of both the arms and the body. And then what I'll do is I'll erase the parts that I don't need. Rotating the canvas just so I get a nice smooth line following the arc of my hand. And now for the parts I don't need, I'm just going to go in and erase those. As you can see, it's slowly coming together now. I always find like whilst creating illustrations, like fun and new ways of creating the shapes, as you saw them, like creating a semicircle, just creating a circle and erasing half it. It's just makes it a lot simpler. Now that we've got most of the character done, let's go in and fill in some of the leaves at the side. And remember, each element on a separate layer, so when we do come to add shading and some texture, it'll be a lot easier to do that. I think I want to keep these as 3 just to kind of match this, so. Like I mentioned at the beginning, anything in the background, I want it to be light, and anything in the foreground, a lot darker. And then the background color, I'm just going to change this to this off-white that I quite like using. And I'm going to find the backpack layer and then draw below that for the pencil and the brush. I feel like for me, this is like one of the most exciting parts of the whole process. As all the research and all the breakthroughs that you've had, you get to see it all come together. So what I'm going to do, because I want to color the top of this triangle in. So I'm going to click on this layer, click select. Now only this part's highlighted, and then on a new layer, with that selection, just color in, and then it keeps it within that line. So you don't have to worry about keeping it within the initial line that you created. And that's finished by adding the sun and the clouds, and then I'm going to go through and add in the shadows. So this is what we've got without any highlights or shadows. Now let's go in and add these. And because we created each element on different layers, adding this is going to be quite simple. So I'll start off with the shadows. So I'm just going to go through and selecting each different element and adding a shadow according to the reference. So I'm going to use one of my brushes that I've created. And one thing I like to do is I like to select the color and then just go a little bit darker. Like we mentioned, any clothing that's falling on something else, you can add a little shadow underneath that too. And because we've got this strap as well, there's going to be a slight shadow from that strap as well. So little details like this, that makes the illustration a lot more convincing. So with this, when I'm adding the shadows, I like to build it up slowly, just so I know, is it too dark or is it just right? One thing I find about this section is trying to find the layers can be quite difficult. You can find yourself scrolling through, like, where's this layer, where's that layer? But what I like to do when choosing these colours is to kind of have a bit of fun. As long as the colour's a little bit darker, using it for the shadows works well. As you see, I did a base of like a dark yellow, and then added an orange on top. This was something that came to me whilst I was kind of experimenting with block previously. I was like, let me try this, let me try that, and then just go with something that I like. I remember, because we got the cap, there's going to be a slight shadow from the top of the cap. Okay, now for the top and the sleeve. So I've isolated the arm, and let's begin. The bottom section, and then I'm going to select the body itself, and then add some shadow there too. And then on the inside of the arm, now I'm select a darker orange, and then just add a little bit more just underneath here, just so this stands out. And now for this shadow here, where the arm crease is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the selection tool on a new layer and draw where that crease would be. Like so. And then with the dark orange, just start colouring in here a little bit to kind of show that there's a crease there. To help separate this section here, it's called a rim light. What I like to do is have a little highlight on the edge. The way I like to do this is by actually removing the shadow rather than adding in a highlight. So I'll use the same brush just on the erase tool. And just tease it just a little bit. So it just helps that stand out just a little more. Now I'm moving on to the backpack. So find your new layer above it, and then clip and mask, and then select a darker colour. And like we did before, like for the shadow, for where the pocket would be for the ruler, just create a line. Again, try on a new layer. I'm going to add a slight shadow just at the bottom of both the brush and the pencil, just to further communicate that they're behind or inside the bag. Now that we've added the majority of the shadows to the character, let's go ahead and start adding some shadows to the foliage around the character too. So because these are behind the orange one, there will be a slight shadow just there too. And with these, what I like to do is kind of add a little detail, and to make it a little different is create a new layer above it, make it a clip and mask, and then using the pencil brush and a lighter colour, add some details. And then same for the other one too. And then just erasing a little bit of detail at the bottom where the shadows would be. Around this leg, as you can see, it is kind of blending all together. So I'm going to increase the darkness of the orange just to kind of create some contrast around the leg to help it stand out a little more. Another way I like to add interest to these bushes and plants is just to add a scribble. So the squiggle, I always find just like scribbling or just like making long fluid lines, for me, firstly, it's like, I find it quite satisfying and entertaining. And then it kind of just adds a bit of texture and interest just to kind of make it stand out a little bit from the foreground and the character itself. And now for the hills, what I'm going to do is add a little bit of mist at the bottom of the hills just to kind of show the depth. So I'm just selecting a lighter colour, and then I'm going to go in with a soft brush, which can be found under the airbrushes. making it a slight gradient. And then same for the hill in front. What we could make it look. Now what I like to do is just add a slight gradient to the sky, just to help the clouds stand out a little bit. Okay, so now that we've got a good base and most of the illustration is done, what I like to do next is go in and refine it and add some little details here and there. So one thing I know I'm going to do is add a little bit of highlights close to the items that are near the sun. So I'm going to select the brush that I'm using and then start off with the trousers. Just the same again for the t-shirt. And now to make it just a little bit more personalized, I'm just going to go in and start adding little details here and there. So I'm going to start off with the trousers, adding like a slight roll up. And because this is in front of the leg, we need to go and add a shadow just behind it. And then same for the leg too. And now using the pencil brush, I'm just going to go in and add some further detail. Okay, so like mentioned before, with the squiggles I did on these darker bushes at the front, I do like to add them to some of the other ones too. So the way I like to do it is just to create a layer just above everything, and then just kind of let your hand flow, have like a quiet free flow, and get a feel of which one you like. For me, like I mentioned, like I do feel when I get to the stage where I start in little details, and especially the squiggles and the free flowing lines, I always feel like myself when it comes to creating. As you can see, like a lot of my art and illustrations do involve like free flowing lines, so definitely helps when I get to that stage again. So the last thing I like to do is just to go and have a look at every separate element as is and see if there's anything I can do to it. So like say here, I'm just going to go and clean these lines up and then add a little detail to the brush and the pencil. And then just some more details on the bag just over here. What I'm doing now is I can see that there's no shadow underneath the ground that the characters stood above, so I'm just going to trial and see if it works. The last thing I'm looking for now is just kind of the highlights and the shadows. Just having one last look to see if there's anything else that I want to add to help each element pop on their own, but obviously work together. I think I'm going to add a bit more shadow to this area here, just to help separate these two. The difference is quite subtle, but it does help with the overall illustration. And then finally, like what I did previously with the rim light, I'm just going to remove some of this on his elbow. Here I can see there's quite a bit of empty space. I'm going to go in and add another hill. And then like we did previously, just add a slight light section just at the bottom, just to kind of represent mist. And I'd say it's roughly around there where I feel like the illustration has come together. I've added in the detail, the shadows, the highlights, and the final little details here and there, like you saw with the cuffs and the detailing on the shirt. This is where I like to finish illustration and end it, where I feel like I've done everything that I would normally do with my creative process. I've looked at it enough and analysed each section, and for me, this is a finished illustration. Congratulations on making it to the end of the class. I know we've covered a lot with regards to AI and implementing it within your creative process, but like mentioned, it will take some time to get used to using it and how to tailor it towards your style and towards the prompts that you want to generate. It did take me a while to get to grips with using it, but I feel once you started using it for a while, you'll definitely be incorporating it into your creative process, whether you are having creative block or not. As for me, it sped up my workflow a lot, especially in the brainstorming phase. I'm super excited to see what you've created based on the prompt that ChatGPT gave you and the illustration that you created. It'll be great if you can share both the prompts and the illustration down below in the projects panel, where I can provide feedback on how you can further tailor your prompts with ChatGPT or any improvements that you could do to your illustration too. If you found this class helpful, feel free to head over to my channel where you can find a lot more like this. Alright, that's all. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.